Chapter 17. At a later period, Aymar added several postscripts to his defense of Bertrand Caillet, known as Bertrand Caillet of the 204th Battalion of the National Guard. We have quoted elsewhere part of one to the effect that the uprising of the Commune was due to a kind of infectious disease. The following paragraphs, too, are of interest. After the trial and conviction of Bertrand, Colonel Galliez returned my manuscript. Mon cher Aymar Galliez, he said, there are ideas in this thesis of yours which you would have done better not to express, and that is why I am returning this to you. Destroy it. Such things are dangerous. I replied stiffly, for his plagiarism of my work had annoyed me not a little, and his present schoolmasterish reprimand struck me in a sensitive spot. They seem to have been good enough for you to have used, I said. But you are right. I have noticed myself that the Commune is afraid of ideas. However, I have never allowed timidity to restrain me from exercising that freedom of thought and expression which an earlier and more successful Commune once procured for us. To my surprise, for I knew his intransigence, he smiled and put his arm around me. Come, Aymar, you really don't seriously believe all the things you wrote there, do you? As a matter of fact, I didn't, and yet I did, so I answered evasively. And what if I do? He said. And are you going to be a priest? Perhaps, I answered. You? Aymar Galliez? You in a soutane with a cross hanging over your belly? No, I can't believe it. He laughed. We had a few words of rather friendly discussion. Knowing me of the party, he was unwilling to be too severe, but he warned me to be careful of speaking out of turn. Indeed, he himself was a dangerous man, and he is one of those whom I have set down as infected by Bertrand, and he was to prove it shortly. I did not think then that I was to see him under a soutane, and with a cross hanging over his belly, sooner than I was to find myself in such attire. This rather curt conclusion to the fate of Galliez in Aymar Galliez's script is readily expanded, for the history of the last few days of the Commune has been meticulously compiled. The reader will recall that the delegate to the ex-prefecture of police had arrested many people, especially of the clergy, to keep as hostages. The avowed and widely published threat was that the Commune of Paris would kill 2 hostages for every one of their party shot by the government of Versailles. The chief purpose of the Commune, however, seems to have been to intimidate Adolphe Thiers to return Blanqui, who was being held a prisoner by the Versaillists. The captive Archbishop of Paris, threatened with death unless Blanqui was returned, himself wrote a letter to Thiers in which he pleaded that Blanqui be exchanged for himself. Among other things, he said that Blanqui, the communist, was of no value to the Commune and not to be feared, for the Commune followed none of his ideas. If he were associated with the Commune, far from being a help, he would only be a new element of discord in the party. But Thiers refused. The efforts of the American ambassador failed, as did the efforts of many others. Some communards claimed that Thiers wanted the Archbishop killed so as to rouse the populace against the Commune. This seems really far-fetched, and if the Commune suspected as much, nothing was easier than not to slay the Archbishop. But perhaps it was too late to exercise clemency. The Versailles army was marching on Paris. A gate was taken, the army poured in, barricades were thrown up. Terrific street fighting ensued. Every window might conceal a communist with a gun fighting like a cornered rat. This last week was one of no mercy. There is such a thing as a drunkenness that comes from a surfeit of bloodshed. The mob of Paris, outraged by endless murders, howled but only for more blood, like a man drunk with liquor who, while lying wretched and puking under the table, still craves another drink and yet another. On the 24th of May, on the 3rd day of street fighting, a firing squad had come to the prison of La Grande Roquette and demanded 6 hostages, among them the Archbishop, to be executed immediately. For what? It was too late now for a dramatic warning to Versailles to release Blanqui. This was the end. The army of Versailles, circling like a python, was slowly crushing the Commune to death. The ribs of the city were cracking. The air was full of flying death. While we are still in possession of the Archbishop, let us execute him. Tomorrow may be too late. So the communards thought. On the 25th, Clavier, the commissaire who had been in charge of the Piepus affair, came to take the banker Jecker out of his cell. The director of the prison wished to see an order before he would consent to release Jecker. Clavier had none, but being of a compliant nature, he wrote one out in the spot and signed it too. The director accepted the paper at the point of a pistol and found the combined argument exceedingly valid. The banker who was suspected of having made and concealed millions had actually been ruined in his Mexican speculation by his fellow bankers, for there is no more loyalty of caste among capitalists than in any stratum of society, although more power, for ill and good. Clavier marched out with his prisoner, and after a fairly long walk found a quiet and convenient spot, placed his captive against a wall, and while the latter pleaded softly, "Don't make me suffer," the order was given to fire. Some gamins of the neighborhood amused themselves by kicking the dead body. Curiously, the firing was heard by Colonel Galliez, who happened to be passing along an adjoining street. He felt this to be a kind of poaching on his special province, he being the head of the court-martial. The two thereupon agreed to join forces. Clavier and he first had lunch, then they met by appointment and proceeded once more to the Roquette prison. Revolvers were loosened in the holsters and a list of prisoners demanded. The director had learned his business by this time and complied at once. Galliez read out the names and marked down 50, 10 being clericals, 4 of them monks arrested at the Paris Commune, 40 being guards and agents of imperial days. 50. That was all he wanted. He did not have men enough to handle more. In the prison there was much commotion. The inmates had seen 7 go to their death and were frightened. To reassure them and obviate resistance, the guards repeated that this was to be a mere change of prison. Many believed, "We are going to take you to the Mairie of Belleville, because they have no more bread here for so many prisoners." Moreover, the number of names called out was in self-reassuring. 1, even 6 might be placed before a firing squad, but 50. The jailers, passing down the line, unlocked many cells from which no inmates were called out. This was done because several of the older jailers had run away and the men left did not know the prison. Thus was opened the cell in which Jean Robert was locked. His term had long expired, but still he was in jail, so that though his name was not called, he thought it an excellent idea to step out as if he heard himself called. There might be a possibility of escape. For months now, he had had no news of his family. He saw men hastily making bundles of their effects. He quickly snatched his own overcoat, his only possession, and ran out. No effort was made to control the prisoners. The men were simply hustled into a line and marched off to the sound of fife and drum. Some of them were bareheaded, but most had had time to dress and to tie up a few things in a kerchief. The captive guards of Paris of imperial days took pride in marching smartly. The priests, hindered by their soutans, dragged behind. All around were the faders, the men of the National Guard, adhering to the Commune, guns held in readiness. Jean Robert, his limbs stiff from years of sitting on the box and months in prison, walked among the clerics. Robert's first surprise was to note the crowds on each side of the street, the shouts of anger, the vegetables that came flying along with kicks and fisticuffs. What was it all about? Why were they shouting death to the hostages? "Where are we going?" he asked the monk walking beside him. "To Golgotha," the latter answered curtly and resumed his muttered prayers. The coachman, though he had worked for years in Paris, could not recall any place with that name. He wanted more information but was a little shy of interrupting the prayers of the monk a second time. The guards, fearing that the mob would snatch the prisoners to a sooner death, secured reinforcements from a barricade manned by the 74th Battalion. From then on the way was quieter. The column moved up the Rue de Paris and turned into the Rue Haxo, escorted by an enormous and constantly growing mob. No escape for me. Well, another prison then, Jean Robert said to himself, and resigned himself with a sigh. Indeed, the number of men with guns, the number of escorting boys who had joined with the march, grew every minute. 100 pairs of eyes were constantly fixed on every prisoner. Jean Robert shrank a little within himself. What if it were to be discovered that he was not supposed to be with this group and he were excluded? Even a change of prison was a novelty to be enjoyed. At this moment the whole column marched through a long and broad archway into a courtyard and past several small houses, issuing from thence onto what was half an ornamented garden, half a vegetable patch. The prisoners were bunched up against a wall at the higher end. The mob that had poured in continued to Howl for the death of the hostages. Jean Robert's slow mind began to understand. The escort of the National Guard had protected them from the brutal mob only to bring them here to die in more military style. Surprised, he shouted out, "But they are going to shoot us." A great fear clamped itself around his heart with claws of steel. He made a move to run forward. A guard with a far-off dreamy expression on his face pushed Robert back roughly to the wall and held him there with the stock of his gun, while he continued to think of something else. "But I'm not guilty." Robert cried. "None of us are guilty," said the young monk quietly, and sought to lay a consoling hand on him. "But," Robert shouted, and angrily shook off that kind hand that wished to force him gently into death. His eyes were popping out of his head. There was a lump in his throat so big that he couldn't talk without great pain. The saliva drooled from his mouth. "I don't want to die," he exploded violently. "Hush," said the monk. "We must all learn to die." "But I don't want to die," Robert cried again. Sweat was beading his brow from the terrible strain of uttering words. Below in the garden, the soldiers were disputing about the firing. Some members of the Commune made a vain last effort to stop the crime, but it had gone too far. The public, so long urged on by their leaders to shout for blood, had become infected with the lust for murder. "Let's get out of here," the members of the Central Committee whispered to each other. A moment later, when the shooting began, there was not an important official in sight. The guards left the prisoners to join the firing squad. "Here!" Robert shouted, and was about to run after his guard who was moving away. "I'm not one of..." He got no further. The guard, now distinctly annoyed, forced him back with a vicious blow in the pit of the stomach. Robert clasped his hands over his belly. His mouth yawned for a breath which his paralyzed muscles refused to give him. In an agony of pain, he dropped to one knee, and the guard moved off and out of range. The monk, seeing Robert kneeling beside him, turned quietly with his fingers raised. Ego te absolvo ab omnibus, the formula for conditional absolution. Robert was still struggling for air when the firing began. Some fruit trees, still half in blossom, were in the way. Soon their pretty spring foliage was torn to shreds, their branches hung broken, their bark scored and burnt. In lulls while the men reloaded, the wind brought snatches of a waltz from a nearby encampment of German occupation soldiers, who were amusing themselves out of doors in the pleasant weather. When the victims lay in heaps, revolvers were drawn and endless coups de grace administered. Bayonets were brought into play. Later autopsies were to reveal bodies with 60-70 bullets in them and as many bayonet wounds. Many of the firing party too bore wounds inflicted by their own careless comrades. When the execution was considered complete, Colonel Galliez and Cleo investigated. They had lined up 50 men, but they counted 51 bodies. Galliez shrugged his shoulders. "Decidedly there's one too many." They did not wait to examine into the matter more carefully. There was need for hurry. Step by step, barricade after barricade, the Versailles troops were wresting the city from the communards. There were still 315 hostages left at La Grande Roquette prison. On the following day, a man named Foray tried to secure them either for a firing squad or as volunteers for fighting on the barricades. But the fighting in neighboring streets was coming so close that he gave up in the midst of things and left the prison with almost every cell door open. The majority of the inmates thought themselves likely to be safer in jail than outside, and for greater security proceeded to barricade themselves within their prison. Some tried to escape, and these bold ones fell into the hands of communards who executed them at once. The next morning the Marines had captured the district, and the hostages were liberated. Then began those terrible moments which were so like cataclysms of nature, like earthquakes and avalanches, that words seem incapable of describing them. The retreating communards had set fire to various public buildings. Groups of men and some of women went about destroying the best structures in the quarters that had to be evacuated. Among these mad women who were setting fire to the best that Paris contained was Sophie de Blumenberg. On this, the last day before the end, Sophie had not left the 204th Battalion. She had taken a pair of boots from a dead boy. They fitted her small feet. Somewhere, too, she had picked up the overcoat of a Zoo uniform. Several days before, the 204th had been called to protect the barricades of the 9th Ward. The battalion was almost wiped out there, for the Versailles forces seized a barricade in the rear Rue Camartin and poured a deadly fire into their unprotected backs. 16 of the company taken prisoners were executed at once and within sight of the remaining few who had been able to retreat to another barricade. The few survivors of the 204th were now standing about the Mairie on the place Voltaire and talking about the event as they had been ever since it had taken place. Sophie, unashamed of her love, continued to make open inquiries. Now, though no one could remember having seen Bertrand on that morning, they nevertheless added his name to the list of dead. It made the disaster the more impressive and formidable. Dead along with the others, they commented briefly and shook their heads. They made no attempt to twit her. Their present great desire was to discover how such a calamity could have overtaken them. It seemed to them impossible that their defeat was a natural result of the chances of war. They suspected treason. And this suspicion, after lighting on any number of people, fell at last on Captain de Montfort, who had ordered them to that position, who had specified the placing of the barricades and who had left the one in the rear insufficiently manned, evidently on purpose. As soon as the men began to build upon this supposition, they found more and more valid reasons. 3 were outstanding. First, Montfort's aristocratic ancestry and demeanor, his love of cantering around on his horse in his blue and gold uniform and shouting down his orders from above, all convincing evidence of relations with Versailles. Second, his natural jealousy of Bertrand, which would be likely to lead him to treachery in an effort to erase his rival. Third, his insistence on that day, during a little altercation among the officers, that the barricades should be here and there and manned. Thus, usually he had taken little part in discussions of military strategy. To this was added a story which was true, and which someone now thought of for the first time. A few days before, Captain de Montfort had come up to the ministry in the Rue Saint-Dominique. He was slightly drunk and in an ugly mood. His wild gestures caused the guard to raise his bayonet and prevent the captain's entry. Montfort was beside himself with fury. He called down curses on the whole guard, and noticing that they were from the 204th Battalion, which he knew was Bertrand's, he sneered. The 204th, huh? You fellows seem to be a rare pack of scoundrels. That's a battalion that needs a good purging. Sophie cared little about the decimation of the 204th at the Madeleine, but the fact that Beryl had gotten rid of Bertrand in this fashion made her sick with grief, a grief which rapidly boiled over into a wild desire for vengeance. It was Captain Beryl de Montfort's misfortune just then to come riding along on horseback in the direction of the barricade on Boulevard Voltaire, and Sophie, seeing him first, pointed him out with her finger, yelling, "There's the dirty traitor!" He heard her voice and reined in his prancing steed, with cries of, "Kill him! Kill the traitor!" A dozen soldiers raced up to him. A score of arms seized him and yanked him from his saddle. He was tossed, thrown about, dragged toward the Mairie, until his beautiful uniform was a mass of rags, his features lost amid bruised and swollen flesh. Sophie, catching a glimpse of him through the mob that surrounded him, opened her mouth in horror. She wanted to run away but restrained herself. Serves him right, the traitor. She had completely forgotten that for several months now she herself had been aiding Beryl in precisely this sort of treachery. The Mairie was crowded with women sewing sacks to hold earth for the barricades. Foray and Genton, 2 officers there, decided that a trial must be held. It must be regular, men, they shouted over the tumult. The captain was taken out on the square, which was massed with soldiers and curious spectators. Many did not know what was happening, but they heard the cry of traitor and took it up. It was slow business plowing through the mob with a prisoner whom everyone wished to injure. Progress was further impeded by a long line of hearses, draped in red flags, which were climbing up the hill to Père Lachaise. "His turn now," someone cried, and the impatient mob repeated the phrase in 100 variations. Genton and Foray kept repeating to the men who barred the advance, "It's got to be regular. We must be just. The Commune has decided to bring him up before the court-martial." This assurance and the commanding position that Genton seemed to occupy with his scarlet sash about his waist allowed the escort and their prisoner to finally cross the square and reach the Rue Sedaine. A shop on this street had become the new headquarters of several battalions. A revolutionary tribunal was improvised on a moment's notice. Colonel Galliez took charge. Genton and Ferret assumed the role of assessors. It was a mere parody of justice. There was not an iota of evidence to implicate Beryl de Montfort. He had been vain, yes, imperious, yes, and negligent perhaps, but of communications with Versailles, of treachery of any kind, nothing. The judges wished to save Montfort, whom they knew well and whose cousin, Edouard Moreau, was a member of the Central Committee and one of the big men of the Commune. But in the face of the mob, they did not dare proclaim him innocent. The prisoner himself would not speak, could not perhaps speak. His eyes were closed by puffy bruises. Blood ran from the corner of his tightly shut mouth. He sat in impassive silence. Only once he murmured, but so low that his voice scarcely carried to the judges. "I'm innocent. Who dares call me a traitor?" None of the judges could believe him guilty. They were, in fact, certain of his innocence, and that being the case they ought not only to have said as much, but they ought also to have extended protection to him. They did neither. True, they found him guilty only of negligence and ordered him merely degraded from his captaincy, but they specified that he should be sent to the nearest barricade and take his share of the fighting. One of the assessors added as a sop to the mob, "If he shows signs of cowardice, bash in his head." The hint was sufficient, and the mob saw to it that it was carried out. He was left lying for dead in a ditch covered with the mud and phlegm that was thrown and spat on him by the crowd. The same crowd that, barely 8 weeks before, had made a bonfire of the guillotine on this same place Voltaire, and had welcomed with wild acclamations of joy the news that the legislators of the Commune had abolished capital punishment. But the odor of blood was in the air. The feel of approaching death roused the worst that hides in man. The Versailles troops had taken the whole left bank. They were beginning to encircle the remainder of the city, still in the bands of the Commune, and wherever their assaults carried a barricade, they set up at once their temporary booths of methodic, pitiless, thorough repression, court-martial, summary execution, and their revenge was as 50 to 1. At this crisis of the expiring Commune, it was natural that the most violent members should seize the reins of action, for at such moments the milder men think of retreat or else grow desperate along with the others. The blame for the firing of Paris will never be fixed on any one man, but it can be blamed on the Commune as a whole, and excused, if such actions demand excuse, by the strain of the moment. It was wrong to burn the treasures of Paris, valuable libraries, irreplaceable archives. It was wrong not because these things have half the value that is placed on them, but because the burning was the mere gesture of a beaten man taking a spiteful blow at his opponent's children. Yes, if the burning of libraries, museums, archives would abolish poverty, I call the exchange cheap. But this had no symbolic meaning, nor any real value. Nevertheless, the burning was carried out with a certain amount of planning. Since the men were needed at the barricades, women were enlisted for the job. They were provided with petroleum and with torches that were formerly part of the equipment of the policemen. The job was a dangerous one, but many volunteered for it, some attracted by the 10 francs a day which was the pay allotted. Of such was Epouse Jean Robert, wife of the coachman Jean Robert, who worked in the company of her 2 little children, 2 left of 5, whom she could not well leave behind. Now that she was earning money, her children each held a fat cut of cervelat and nibbled on it. They had starved for months, and now for once they were no longer hungry, and though their bellies rebelled against more food, they couldn't keep their teeth from wanting the feel of food again and again, as if to reassure themselves that this was true. Others joined because they were enraged at Versailles. Their husbands had been killed or some other great loss had struck them, and they were anxious now to deal a blow, no matter how or where, but preferably against the rich, their permanent oppressors. These things we can never have, these great mansions, these halls of fine furniture, they said. Let us burn them. They shan't have them either. And Sophie? She joined because she wanted to die. She joined because she itched to go mad. She joined because those of Versailles, whom she had so often aided by her information, had betrayed her Bertrand and killed him on the barricades. Yes, and if only she could have been fully certain that he was dead, if she could have seen his body, she would have killed herself at once, too. Aymar, during these terrible days, kept as much to his rooms as possible. Still he could not restrain himself at times from going out to have a look at things. He used to go up the Boulevard de Batignolles to a place where one could get a good look at Paris. A number of people used to meet there. They would watch the great fires which in the twilight changed from black and white photographs to colored lithographs. The dun smoke first took on red and orange glows and then, when night was complete, disappeared completely and one saw only flames and sparks. The people would guess what was burning. From the distance it was hard to say. The Tuileries, the Louvre, the Palace of Justice, the Hall of Accounts, the Palace of the Legion of Honor, the Palais Royal, etc., etc. The heat of the conflagration was such that it reached out to quarters that were still being defended. There was fire at the Château d'Eau, fire at the Boulevard Voltaire, fire at the Grenier d'Abondance. The Seine, already red with blood, rolled through Paris like a dragon with fiery reflecting scales. Straws from the granary, papers from the records flew burning through the air. As the soldiers of Versailles took new positions, they organized fire squads and were assisted by the fire department, which the communards had prevented from functioning as long as they remained in charge of these districts. While the great bulk of the city was soon in the hands of the Versaillists, the communards still held on to a number of positions: the town hall of the 11th Ward, Belleville, the Buttes Chaumont, etc. During the night of May 27 to 28, the last fierce fighting took place. Terrible guerrilla retreat of the Faders, from tombstone to tombstone in Père Lachaise. Finally, a last remnant of 128 of the communards were forced against a wall and shot. When the sun rose on the 28th, Pentecostal Sunday, the Civil War was over, except for a house here and there from which still came stray shots fired haphazardly, and except for a single barricade on Rue Ramponneau, where a lone communard planted a red flag and defended his position for a short time. He fled. The red flag was torn down and the tricolor hoisted. On the other side, the side of the Versaillists, who by their victory became the Legitimists, the cruelty had not been any less. On the contrary, though lightly passed over by historians, their deeds were vastly more impressive. Why drag 80 wounded men out of their beds in the hospital improvised at St. Sulpice and shoot them to a death which many were headed for anyhow? Why shoot the attendant Dr. Fano along with them, his only guilt the crime of staying to care for them? Line them up and shoot them. At the market of Place Maubert, in the courtyard of Cluny, at Rue Charonne, at Rue Brizon, the corpses thrown into ditches, not in small numbers, at the most 50, as the communards had done. That was picayune. No, in hundreds. Then order was introduced. The rule went out: no more killings. Prisoners must be court-martialed. And they were court-martialed. The speed of killing was slightly reduced, for the courts at least took the formality of marking down names, but few escaped, for the interrogatory was brisk. No witnesses, no defense. A couple of questions and off went another group of wretches to a convenient wall. Mistakes? Well, of course, considering the haste, Guillaume was shot by 2 different squads. Actually, he escaped to write his famous books. Who were the 2 shot in his stead? De Leon wrote, "I saw him perish. His demeanor was most cowardly. He could scarcely talk for rage." How well one can understand that cowardice and that rage. Courbet, one reads elsewhere, was shot after identification. Who was that? And what was the nature of the identification? The paper Gallois came out with the story. They arrested Billioray at Grenelle. He defended himself, writhed on the ground, begged for mercy. He was done to death where he lay. In another district someone cried, "There goes Billioray." At once the man in question was arrested. He denied his identity vigorously. Brought before Captain Garson, he still persisted in his denial, but a dozen witnesses were ready to swear to it. Captain Garson asked, "Do you still deny?" "Yes, yes," the man screamed wildly. The whole matter was done so quickly that only a few seconds passed before the fellow was lying mortally wounded in a pool of blood. It was then, albeit a little late, that someone searched his pockets. Letters showed that he was a draper's assistant named Constant, who had had nothing to do with the Commune. But he was so badly wounded then that it was deemed advisable to finish him off. Who was the man at Point du Jour, who was also executed as Billioray? The real Billioray was arrested a week later, and subsequently condemned to prison for life. A Dutch traveler, unable to express himself well in French, was brought before the court-martial established at Le Châtelet. The large sums of money on his person were considered proof that he was an important communard about to escape beyond the frontier. He was executed at the caserne of Lobau. Varlin was executed on that Pentecostal Sunday, arrested and tried and shot in as many minutes. So great was the crowd that the firing squad was unable to handle their rifles properly. The man remained standing. A second volley. He fell, and the crowd clapped their hands. Aymar made no effort to escape. He walked about and saw and felt a strange exultation. Burn! He cried within himself at the fiery flames that leaped to the sky. Kill! He shouted to himself when the men lined up in front of a wall dropped to the rattle of musketry. I was not so wrong, he thought, and derived a curious joy from the violence raging about him. He wanted it worse. He wanted the whole world to go up in flames and blood. It wasn't worthy of being anyhow. Rise up. Danton. Marat. Robespierre. Why aren't you here to see that the job is done right? Aymar soon discovered that he was talking nonsense. The Commune shot 57 from the prison of La Roquette. Versailles retaliated with 1,900. To that comparison add this one. The whole famine's reign of terror in 15 months guillotined 2,596 aristos. The Versaillists executed 20,000 before their firing squads in 1 week. Do these figures represent the comparative efficiency of guillotine and modern rifle, or the comparative cruelty of upper and lower class mobs? Bertrand, it now seemed to Aymar, was but a mild case. What was a werewolf who had killed a couple of prostitutes, who had dug up a few corpses, compared with these bands of tigers slashing at each other with daily increasing ferocity? And there'll be worse, he said, and again he had that marvelous rising of the heart. Instead of thousands, future ages will kill millions. Will go on, the figures will rise and the process will accelerate. Hurrah for the race of werewolves. He was thinking such things and exulting one day as he walked through the streets of the city. The executions were now over. Only arrests were being made. Bands of soldiers and police were systematically ransacking every home. Every suspect was arrested at once. The least suspicion was enough. A mailman denounced a family because it received more than its usual mail. The grocer denounced another because it bought an extra sausage. So-and-so was taken in because he didn't answer quickly enough. Another because he walked too fast, or else too slow. No reason was too insane to provoke an arrest. No excuse too slight for suspicion. In 3 weeks the police received 379,523 anonymous letters of denunciation. Such events, such sights and thoughts, raised not only pity in Aymar's heart, but also a wild sense of satisfaction. The grand and delightful balm of I told you so. This was, after all, the proof of the pudding. See those soldiers busy clearing the streets of cadavers? See those corpses being tossed into a foundation that had been prepared for the erection of a school, or perhaps for a church, or for the building of a house in which more families of werewolves were to breed? The police service was still unorganized, but squads of soldiers saw that bodies were placed discreetly out of sight, that is to say, they were laid side by side off the main thoroughfares, and some spades of earth thrown over them in order to conceal blood-stiffened clothes. A little earth and a little time was enough, and the race of werewolves would forget. Homo economicus rose up amid the smoldering ruins and began to flourish again. One man went up and down street after street with a handcart. The sight of a body, he would stop, uncover himself piously and mutter a brief prayer. Then he would wave his hat before he put it on again in order to chase away the flies, and with a rapid and practiced hand, he would strip the corpse of its footgear and throw boots or shoes into his cart. The harvest was plentiful. Some suspicious people stopped him, questioned him. He replied politely, for official identification, and went about his business. Aymar, seeing him, said briefly, 18th, eh? And enjoyed the startled expression on the man's face. A minor werewolf, he thought, and laughed to himself. Altogether these were enjoyable days for Aymar. He saw a priest going down one street and whistled. Under the soutane and the cross, Aymar had recognized Colonel Goys, the terrible slayer of the hostages, for whom everybody was on the lookout. I'll give him a scare, the wolf in sheep's clothing, Aymar thought, and approached him with a Latin phrase. Pax vobiscum. If it isn't our old pastor Fidus Goys. Goys shivered. For God's sake, Galliez, he pleaded in a trembling voice. But Aymar couldn't control at least one joke. You'd have shot yourself on sight in the old days. Well, yes, these were enjoyable days for Aymar, enjoyable until he was arrested, and even to that there was some enjoyment. In groups of 150 to 200, tied hand to hand or elbow to elbow in rows of 4, the prisoners were marched out of the cellars of the Luxembourg to the ramparts, and from there down the long road to Versailles, day after day until some 40,000 had made the journey. Side by side marched old fighters, some in uniform, others in sketchy workmen's costumes hastily donned. Their faces were lined and feverish, and they all looked like drunkards, as men always do when they are unshaven. Old men stumbled along, linked to weeping children or to girls in fantastic uniforms who had snatched up a rifle to defend the barricades, or to gray-haired matrons, preserving their dignity with difficulty as they walked beside servants in calico and aprons, all somehow caught up in the rebellion or by mistake numbered among the prisoners. And here and there a figure in redingote, erect, sober, a man with the face of a scholar or an artist who had added his beautiful dreams of utopia to the sad fiasco of the Commune. This column of rags and remnants moved slowly along the dusty roads beneath the fierce heat of the June sun. The guards rode on horseback, loaded guns across their knees like gauchos conducting cattle to the slaughterhouse. Short halts were made at Sèvres and again at Viroflay, and then the troops entered Versailles through the gate of Paris. Now came the most terrible part of the journey, the march through the regal city of Versailles, between lanes of closely packed people, a fanatic multitude, void of all sense of balance, void of pity and of intelligence. The city of the rich here demonstrated that it, too, could form mobs as mad as those of the poorest quarters of Paris. Not bare, dirty or callous fists were shaken at the cohort, but neatly gloved hands, hands of demi-mondaines in lace gauntlets and hands of bankers in yellow kidskin, and voices that spoke correct French howled. No prisoners! Death to the bandits! And the fine clothes rushed the line, broke through the protecting file of horsemen, and the snobs and the elegant ladies, seizing the opportunity to strike a blow, without fear of retaliation, lashed out. The men prodded with their canes and the women swung their pretty parasols, or removed one glove to let their sharp nails leave furrows across the face of a young girl. Petrolaus, they shouted, for though only a handful of women had actually done incendiary work, all the 1,000 and more women arrested were suspected of having burnt a palace or two. Even the 650 children seemed demons. And Aymar chuckled. More werewolves, he exulted, oblivious to the blows that rained upon him. The world is full of them. How is it that I once thought they were rare? I was once one myself and didn't know it. Versailles couldn't accommodate all these prisoners. They were guarded in great courts, halls, cellars, under the months of cannons, while Thiers vainly thumbed his history books to find a solution to the problem of taking care of this mass. Great batches, transported in long cattle trains, were sent to fortresses on the coast and summoned separately to their trials. Scores were to be condemned to death, hundreds were to be sentenced to imprisonment for life, thousands were to be deported to tropical islands. These enormous figures are thus fairly credibly explained. The moaning of the great heap of dying and dead hostages would not cease, and it was impossible to tell where the sounds were coming from, so that there was nothing to do but keep on firing and stabbing until there was complete silence. See Laurent's Histoire de la Commune, page 625, and Vuillant Mes Caillas. Rouges au temps de la Commune, page 116 etc. Pun in French. Resold shoes are twice new, that is to say, deux fois neufs, which is also 2 times 9 or 18. Chapter 18. Where shall I end my tale? This has neither beginning nor end, but only a perpetual unfolding, a multi-petaled blossom of strange botany. Why should I not end here? Why should you want to know of the death of this werewolf rather than another? Consult your mortuary registers. Were these men and women, or were they only disguises that concealed nameless monsters, warm incubators of infamies which would congeal your blood if brought out from their bowels into the light of day for you to see? The earth does not swallow the dead, but only their corpses, which were the envelopes of their hates and crimes. These are never buried, but live on imperishable to write more gruesome records every generation. What is it you would know? Sophie, the records of the Ministry of War, the Gazette de Tribunaux, inform us that she was condemned to be deported as implicated in the case of Beryl de Montfort. He himself came to the trial, limping and his right arm withered by a shot through the nerve. He wept out of one eye. The other was dry and closed. It had been eaten by flies as he lay dead in the ditch beside the barricades of Place Voltaire. The transport Danae sailed on its interminable journey to New Caledonia. Journey lasting 5 months without Sophie. Her father had brought his wealth into play and saved her from the penal colony. His surprise had been great when he returned to Paris and learned of what had happened. Only one letter had come through to him. It was from Aunt Louise Herzog, and it told of the disappearance of Sophie and Beryl de Montfort. Aunt Louise wrote, "Won't tell me where Sophie is, but obviously he must know." The Baron had read the letter with mixed feelings, but after he had considered for a while he had decided, let fire burn. And thinking of his wife and of Louise Herzog, he had added, and let ice follow the rules of ice if it so desires. And then he had chuckled, lucky Beryl. If only I were in his shoes. Well, life goes on. A few years more, or maybe only a few weeks. And where will we be? Let her have her fling. He had looked across his desk to a mirror hanging on the wall, and he had noted the growing whiteness of his remaining sparse hairs. And as for Sophie, she had had her fling. She did not know whether Bertrand was dead or alive. She did not care. She wanted to kill herself but could not summon the courage to meet death. The horror of the night was so strong in her that she took care not to go to bed too sober, nor alone if she could manage it. Beryl's heart was numb with pain at the sight of her conduct. He spoke to her in gentle reproach one day when they were alone. "Those men," he stuttered. "Those, how can you? Why, you too, you poor fool," she said gaily, and dragged him down to her on a couch. He went home bewildered, entranced, all his old love reawakened and doubled. He forgave her everything, and next day begged her to marry him. "What?" she asked, astounded. Then she wept. "Faithful, loyal Beryl," she said. "After all I've done to you." They set the date of the marriage for the morrow, and that gave her the necessary impetus to kill herself with gas that night. Instead of accompanying her to the Mairie for a civil wedding, he followed her body to the Cimetière Israelite at Père Lachaise. Her father wept silently, her mother noisily. As the earth was spaded over her, Beryl could not restrain his anger. He pointed his good arm to heaven and swore that he would have his revenge. Aymar was released shortly by virtue of a non-lieu, but was summoned again at once to testify in the trial of the painter Courbet. This bluff genius had been responsible, during the Commune, for the tearing down of the Vendôme column, that huge bronze column surmounted by a figure of Napoleon. While the column was being pulled down to the applause of the populace, Courbet was heard to say, "That column is mad at me. I'll bet it's going to fall on me and crush me." It did not fall on him, it fell precisely on the bed which engineers had built to catch it, but it did crush him. Before the tribunal, Courbet maintained that he had acted out of no hatred for the little corporal, but purely out of artistic motives. "That bad imitation of Trajan's column annoyed me. I was ashamed to think that visitors should look upon that as one of the glories of French art, and then no consideration for perspective. And that statue of Napoleon done 7.5 heads tall, just because the rules say so, whatever the actual proportions of the little fellow were." The president said, "You were moved then purely by artistic zeal?" And Courbet answered, "Simply that." He was condemned to 6 months in jail, and the cost of reconstruction, which came to over 350,000 francs, was charged against him. He had not that much money, so his paintings were seized and sold at auction. Today they would fetch enormous sums, and even in his own better days, but for the moment his fame was in eclipse. Even with his furniture thrown in, only 12,000 francs were realized, and the Salon refused to exhibit him any more, holding him morally unworthy. He ran away to Switzerland, but France continued to pursue and dun him. He died at last of a broken heart, and his death was passed over without a word. Courbéism and realism were for the moment out of style. The Impressionists were in. As soon as Aymar was free, he visited Bertrand at La Santé. The head physician was dubious about the possibility of release for the prisoner. He is in good health, but he has moments of rage. Then he smashes the furniture or attacks the guards. The physician saw nothing mysterious in Bertrand. He was just another case. Moments of rage, said Bertrand bitterly to Aymar. Why not? Who wouldn't in this awful hole? You don't seem so anxious to die anymore, do you? Aymar asked. Bertrand hung his head, as if an unwillingness to die were a shame. Imprisonment had made him keen for liberty and life. Please, uncle, he begged. Get me out of here. They treat me so miserably. Aymar smiled. Get you out? How can I? And do you think you ought to be out? Wolves belong in a cage in the zoological garden. But then he thought, why should this one wolf be shut up for an individual crime when mass crimes go unpunished? When all society can turn into a wolf and be celebrated with fife and drum, and with flags curling in the wind? Why, then shouldn't this dog have his day too? Do you ever think of Sophie? Aymar asked. Bertrand closed his eyes as if in deep pain, but after a second he shrugged his shoulder. Sophie. Yes, Sophie. Or any woman for that matter, he concluded fiercely. They don't provide women for the prisoners, eh? Aymar asked. Bertrand breathed heavily. Well, said Aymar, I shall see what can be done, but first tell me, do you ever well change? Bertrand hung his head again. Indelicate question, eh? Like asking a girl if she— Yes, I quite understand. Though outwardly bitter, Aymar was sorry for Bertrand. The prison of La Santé was considered a model one, being only recently constructed, but metal and stone make it best a chilly abode. The director, with whom Aymar consulted, suggested that if Aymar wished to remove his nephew to one of the pay asylums, licensed by the state, the permission could probably be secured. It was thus that Bertrand found himself transported to Dr. Dumas' sanatorium at Saint-Nazaire. Aymar, himself, had gone to inspect various places and had picked out this quiet retreat. Here, if anywhere, Bertrand would be comfortable and well taken care of. The first aspect of the place was inviting. There was a large garden with old, spreading trees shading soft lawns. An old brick wall overgrown with ivy surrounded the estate with a sufficient but gentle barrier. Within the enclosed area were a main building of handsome exterior and several smaller structures. Inside were pleasant large rooms with windows looking out onto the park. The patients were mild creatures. They had perhaps a tendency to think one thought over and over again, like a wheel turning idly after the belt has slipped off, or their minds followed some strange personal logic. Their thoughts were off in a world of illusion, shut up in a private universe, or sunk into a permanent stupor. Some sat in comfortable chairs on the terrace. Others strolled on the lawn, strutted about impersonating Shakespeare or Alexander, or else chased imaginary butterflies. When visitors came to inspect Dr. Dumas' establishment, these were the patients they saw, and the sight was almost pretty children playing in a garden. These were the show patients. It was intended that visitors should picture their dear ones in this scene. Yes, here would be an excellent spot for mother, who has lost the ability to direct her muscles, who can no longer control her bladder or her bowels or lift her cup to her mouth. And can you cure them? Dr. Dumas is asked. He is a handsome fellow, well-built, serene, with the bearded face of a distinguished scholar. He replies evasively but majestically. That depends on the individual case. We can cure some. We can improve all. He points out some of the patients sitting in the shade of the great chestnut trees and gives their case histories. It is enough to convince his visitors. And so poor mother's last dwelling place is fixed upon. She will be better off here than at home, the sons and daughters assure themselves. And we can see her every second Saturday afternoon and any other time upon written notice. Of course the price is steep, but mother is worthy of the best. Good old mother. Some day she will be cured and we'll come and take her home again. But there is more to this hospital than the park and these droll troubadours, who are exhibited to visitors. On the top floor, for example, there are certain rooms which are never shown to visitors, and which on visiting days are locked and barred with the windows tightly shut. If the relatives of a patient in these rooms come to visit, the afflicted one is hastily washed up and made presentable. The violent ones are drugged if necessary and brought into a special visiting room below. Yes, says the doctor. I can note improvements. Of course to the medically untrained. And when the relatives are leaving, now not too frequent visits, please. It upsets them too much emotionally. 4 best results are carefully worked out routine must not be broken. In these upstairs rooms are the patients with disgusting beastly habits. Those who pollute themselves, who make constant obscene motions, those who argue and fight acrimoniously with an imaginary foe, those who must be prevented from killing themselves and thus robbing the doctor of his fee. In one room you may see a poor wretch who grovels on the floor, clinging with his nails to the flooring in mortal dread lest he drop to the ceiling. He has lost all sense of direction due to a disease of the inner ear and knows not up from down nor left from right. He cannot walk, he cannot lie. There is no longer any balance in him. But Dr. Dumas has succeeded in keeping this man alive for 3 years. In another room is a patient who must be fed, who must have her every want attended to. She is the daughter of a nobleman. She looks like a dwarf Chinese woman. She is over 40 years old and has been in various asylums all her life. She is harmless but disgusting, and there is no sense in attempting to tend to her every want. Once in a great while, when her white-haired father drives up in his fine barouche, an orderly throws the little runt into a tub of water. She is divested of her smelly clothes, scrubbed clean and brought down to the visiting room. Her father contents himself with a perfunctory look, hands over a check and leaves. He has heard of people paying through years for the care of a patient who has long departed to a better world, and he is determined not to be taken in. Elsewhere in these garret abodes are epileptics given to violence and horrible shrieks, sufferers of syringomyelia, whose limbs decay and drop off, painlessly melancholic individuals who must be chained in order to prevent suicide, and more horrible types without labels who are simply beasts, unfortunately born from a human womb and therefore credited with a soul, and these are merely kept in a cage, for their locked rooms into which food is thrown are nothing else than that. To Bertrand, intelligent, mild-looking young man that he was, Dr. Dumas first assigned a nice room on the 2nd floor. Bertrand was immensely pleased, and that very first night he made an attempt to escape. But Dr. Dumas was no fool. He gave all his patients this very opportunity only to see how they reacted. The orderly, Paul, a brawny fellow who had gotten his muscles in a blacksmith shop, was on guard. At midnight he saw Bertrand leap from the low balcony and go racing through the bushes. Paul ran to head him off, tackled him and thought to pin him to the ground with ease. But Bertrand had a vigor beyond his appearance and an unaccountable strength in his soft muscles. Moreover, he brought his teeth into play and his fangs ripped through the cloth of Paul's uniform and tore the flesh to ribbons. Paul howled with pain, but held on. The 2 other orderlies came racing to the rescue and Bertrand was finally subdued. So that's the kind you are, said Dr. Dumas. I thought as much. Well, we'll teach you. Take him up to the top floor. Give him the corner room. If you can learn to behave, you'll come down again. It did not take Bertrand long to realize that he had exchanged his nice cell at the hospital prison of La Santé for a genuine hellhole. His new room contained only the minimum of furniture, a narrow cot, a chair and a small table. By standing on the table one could barely reach the sill of the only window, an oval barred aile de boeuf. He kept his rage under control for a while. He promised himself that he would get that fellow Paul yet, and if he ever had his hands on Paul again, that would be the end. He licked his teeth at the thought, and of course he'd tell Aymar all about it when Aymar came, and Uncle would see to it that he got a better room. In fact, there was no sense in waiting 2 weeks for Uncle's visit. He could write to him at once. There was no pen and paper. Bertrand called out for an orderly. There was no answer. He banged on the door, but sounds didn't travel far in this solidly built house. Moreover, the 3rd floor was completely isolated by doors at the top and bottom of the staircase. And as for noise, as for shrieks and banging and all manner of sounds, these were far too common to disturb the orderlies even if they should chance to be on the upper floor. Maddened by the unsuccess of his efforts, Bertrand lashed out in fury. He threw the chair against the door, until that flimsy piece of furniture was in pieces. He ripped the cover of his bed to pieces. Then he subsided in tears. He promised himself to be wiser in the future, to control himself and play the mild-mannered youth, which, he had learned at La Santé, achieved the best results. A round barrel-like fixture on the door clicked. On a little shelf was his food. No orderly came into his room. Perhaps an orderly would never come into his room. They would leave him here forever and tell his uncle he had died. Yes, now he regretted the nice cell he had had at home. What good had it done him to run away? He had only succeeded in getting into La Santé, and from La Santé he had come to this, from bad to worse. But the second Saturday came around, and with it the prospect of being able to unload his misery to his uncle. He had counted without his hosts. In the evening he found himself lying on his bed. His room had been cleaned. There was fresh linen on the bed. His mind groped through the clearing mists of a drug and remembered as if in a dream his uncle's visit. He recalled being led downstairs by Paul. Yes, by Paul. He recalled the visiting room, his uncle seated opposite and questioning him, and himself sitting there stolidly and unable to do more than smile. This time he lost his head completely. He smashed, he tore, he howled until he fell exhausted on the floor and slept. When he woke up feverish, tense, he groaned to know himself alone and unable to find release. He listened. There was a noise in the adjoining chamber. It could be faintly heard. It was the little mongoloid cooing to herself. Bertrand did not know what the origin of the sound was, but the soft feminine voice enchanted him, drew him with the power of a siren. He threw himself against the wall. "A woman!" he screamed. He kicked and scratched. Impossible. The wall was not a simple partition but one of the retaining walls of the house, of solid brick and heavy plaster surface. The noise he had made had evidently frightened the owner of the voice. Bertrand fell to his knees. "Please sing some more. Please, please, I'll be quiet." But the owner of the voice remained silent. So great was his necessity for hearing that voice, sole link with the feminine world, that he learned to control himself, especially in the evening when it generally sang its flat, gentle, monotonous tones. Its timbre was surely only vaguely like Sophie's rich and resonant voice, but Bertrand came to think of it and speak of it as Sophie. "Sing to me, Sophie," he would say. "Sing to me. Do you recall how we used to go walking in the evening, hand in hand? Do you remember?" And the mongoloid crooned soft accompaniment to his reminiscences. The prospect of seeing his uncle was another hope that aided him in keeping himself in check. He had puzzled out the mystery of the drug. Of course they administered it to him in his food. It was only necessary to keep good track of the days as they passed, and avoid eating on Saturday. His trick worked. On Saturday he did not touch his food, hungry as he was. Instead he waited quietly for the afternoon visiting hours. At last he heard footsteps outside. The key squeaked in the lock and the door swung open. It was Paul, the enormous lumbering orderly who, a month ago, had defeated Bertrand's attempt to escape. And now Bertrand made a terrible mistake. Evidently he should have gone meekly with Paul, as if truly drugged, and then revealed his grievances to Aymar. Instead, blinded by his desire for revenge, he leaped on the surprised orderly and would surely have killed him if his screams had not attracted another orderly who ran to his comrade's assistance. Between the two, Bertrand was subdued and tied up. Then Dr. Dumas was summoned. It was a simple question of the injection of a drug by means of a hypodermic needle, and a meek, mild and stupidly smiling Bertrand, neatly attired, was led downstairs. When the drug wore off, Bertrand knew that he had missed his second opportunity and that another would be hard to find. Mad with disappointment, he sank his teeth into a leg of his table, and splintered the wood. When he had made a heap of ruins out of that, he attacked the sheets and blankets of his bed. He took off his shoes and chewed up the leather, cracked the buttons on his clothes. He twisted his spoon, the only implement that was served with his food, into knots and crushed his tin plate. And the following fortnight found him drugged by an easy trick. For the 2 previous days he was starved. He howled with hunger. His empty belly growled. He fell into light dozes from which he woke with vivid dreams of food. And then, there in the revolving tray was a plentiful, appetizing meal. He knew. Yes, he knew that it was visiting day and that he should not touch a bite of it, but he couldn't resist. He gulped down every morsel. As through a dark glass he saw Paul enter and grin at him. Dr. Dumas was incensed at all this breakage. No more linen or blankets for him. Take off his clothes after visiting hours. Let him go naked. And as for his food, throw it on the floor. No more dishes. You can't very well throw soup on the floor, but you can throw a piece of meat. And the orderlies had discovered Bertrand's love for meat. Got to be quite good sport to starve him for a day, then open his door suddenly and fling in a bone covered with shreds of flesh. The orderlies, armed with whips or clubs, would stand in the opening and watch Bertrand pounce upon his food and crouch on the floor to gnaw off and bolt the meat in chunks and then to crack the bone for the marrow fat. For greater amusement, the orderlies liked to offer Bertrand some especially hard bone, the heavy thigh bone of the horse, for example. The sound of enamel grinding against bone filled the room with a sinister crackling. The orderlies trembled and retreated as far as they could, and they held the handle of the door, ready to slam it shut at the least sign of danger. In this they were well advised, for on several occasions Bertrand, irritated by their laughter or excited by their applause, suddenly leaped at them. Once he was rewarded by having his face caught between the door and the jamb so that his cheekbones were nearly crushed in. But on another occasion his teeth managed to reach the leg of Paul, and slash through the cloth, but without catching the flesh. Paul had had enough. He had long thirsted for vengeance anyhow. One day, knowing the doctor absent, he procured a heavy whip from the stable. Bertrand was drugged and chloroformed and tied to the bedpost, where he slumped over the ropes that sustained him, for he was completely unconscious. They took turns beating him, now lashing him with the fine thong, now clubbing him with the butt. Bertrand groaned softly, but he did not wake, though blood spurted from his bruised and shredded back. For weeks after, though his days and nights were one long torture, of all the patients, the men took a peculiar delight in annoying Bertrand. On the days when he was starved preparatory to being drugged, they used to stand outside his door and listen to his mad bellowing. That amused them. And then, when he had been drugged, they found some strange pleasure in manhandling him. He was docile as a sick child. The orderlies scrubbed him, put soap in his eyes or tweaked his nose. He responded with a silly grin. Once an orderly thought of a clever trick. He put sharp tacks through the soles of Bertrand's shoes so that points projected through, and thus Bertrand, oblivious of pain, was walked along the hall and down the flights of stairs to the reception room, where his uncle awaited him. To his uncle's greeting he gave no answer, stood by glumly until Aymar forced him into a seat. Aymar tried to question him. Bertrand continued to glare angrily, or if his face broke into a silly smile, the effect on Aymar was only the worse. He tried kindness. Answer me. Answer me. Please, Bertrand, answer me. Bertrand, look at me. Are you angry at me? Did I not always do my best for you? No father could have struggled harder. And what, after all, did I have to do with you? Neither your mother nor father was any relative of mine. But you came to belong to me, and I came to love you and feel responsibility for you. You were mine, but only as a stray dog sometimes attaches himself to a passerby and will not be shaken off. Bertrand grinned. Well for you to smile, Aymar continued. It was I who had all the pain and disappointment. It is I who now bear all the affront of your ingratitude. Bertrand's smile faded. His face darkened into a scowl. Yes, scowl if you like. But you will be sorry, for I shall not see you much longer. I have received papal dispensation and will soon take holy orders. Then I may be sent far away, to China, to South America, and you will be left here. Will you write to me at least? Probably not. You have answered none of my letters so far. Your brutish nature has swallowed all the learning I gave you. Do you recall how I taught you your letters, cutting the alphabet out of various colored papers, and how you first thought that every letter from red paper was a because it had been cut from red paper? So you will not forgive me for having brought you here, where you are surely better off than in that prison asylum? Here it is expensive and beautiful, and you have the freedom of that great garden, and the care of a famous doctor who means to help you if he can, which I doubt, but at any rate. Well, speak finally. Answer me. Or are you dumb? Aymar rose and yelled into that stolid scowl. He postured, gestured, pleaded. Then he mopped his brow. I am going crazy myself, he thought. It is plain that the poor boy is totally off. He went into the corridor and called an attendant. Goodbye, Bertrand. Who Knows if I shall ever see you again. Bertrand meekly followed the orderly, without so much as another glance at his uncle. Aymar knocked at the doctor's office. Dr. Dumas greeted him with a smile. Come in, M. Galliez. Come in. Have a glass of Porto with me. Aymar was only too happy to sit down and talk to a human being for a change. Dr. Dumas was indeed a kind and intelligent man, one with whom one felt at once at home. And how did you find your nephew, M. Galliez? Aymar sipped his Porto and answered sadly. I'm afraid he's not doing very well. He shook his head and sighed. Well, well, said the doctor, such cases are devilish hard to treat. You must repress their beastly side, and that robs them of their joy in life. They grow angry at the whole world and sulk or else mock you in secret. Here, let me fill your glass. After a few glasses of Porto, Aymar was feeling more mellow. What disturbs me, what in fact wounds me deeply, is that he will not even talk to me. And why does he never answer my letters? Ah, well, M. Galliez, one must put up with such things. Gratitude is rare enough among the sane. For myself, I cannot approach him without raising a scowl on his face. And yet, you know yourself how much care and attention we give to our patients here. What kind of a life is this, after all, to devote oneself, sacrifice everything, in order to relieve the suffering? You should feel ennobled by that, my dear doctor, to attempt to relieve the world's ills from whatever side. Oh, by the way, I intend soon to take holy orders. Really? The doctor was shocked, but recovered quickly. Then allow me to congratulate you. May I drink to your future? There is nothing finer than the career of priesthood. I am not one of those blatant medicos who are so vociferous in their denunciations of the Church. As a man of science, I must be unbiased. As a student of the soul, I know that religion is a potent force. Aymar was pleased. There was something he had had on his heart for a long time. Could he entrust it to Dr. Dumas? I've wondered. I know, of course, that your patients may have Mass said to them if they so desire, but do you, systematically attempt to open their hearts to religion? Do you, for example, try to teach them to pray? You have hit there on one of my pet theories, monsieur. I am gradually working toward that. I neglected that myself in former years, said Aymar, but since the terrors of the last year I have become deeply convinced that man must return to the simple faith of his ancestors, back to what we in our modern sophistication and pride term vulgar superstition. Dr. Dumas nodded his head in agreement, and filled the glasses. There is something, said Aymar, that I have been wanting to ask you. Certainly. You have watched my nephew carefully? Why, monsieur? I am implying no criticism, Aymar declared quickly, but you know of course that I have had my nephew in my care for many years. Yes. Well, have you ever observed him change? Change? What do you mean? I mean into a wolf. Into a wolf? Why, yes. You know, of course, that he is afflicted with lycanthropy. To be sure, but that is a mere name. I beg your pardon, it is the truth. Ah, come, M. Galliez. You would not have me believe that your nephew does more than delude himself? His disease is quite common. I have, in fact, made a study of it, and given considerable attention to the huge mass of testimony in the medieval werewolf trials. There is, in all this testimony, full proof that no one ever saw a werewolf, and the patients themselves confess that they only felt like wolves. Whatever may have been the case, Aymar returned, and I am not prepared to agree with you, for I have studied the matter myself. I am certain that my nephew has been a wolf, and does change into a wolf. And you have seen him do it? The doctor smiled. No, but I am convinced he does. Have you seen the wolf? Dr. Dumas insisted. No, but you seem easily convinced then. The two men, a little flushed from the wine, slowly raised their voices. The doctor could no longer pretend to be a friend of religion. He began to berate the Catholic Church for having burned the werewolves. Aymar defended the Church, claiming that the burning was a kind of sanitary device to stop the infection. Somehow D.D. Home came into the discussion. They went astray here for a moment, while the doctor recalled how Home used to give seances before Imperatrice Eugenie. He used to cause harmonicas to float in the air and play tunes by themselves. Do you believe that? The doctor asked. The Church says that this is the work of the devil, though similar phenomena occur in the lives of the saints. In any case, I should want to see it with my own eyes. Well, of course, Dr. Dumas agreed. Precisely. But here we have a case which, you confess, no one has ever seen. Not you yourself. I have never seen the wolf, true enough, Aymar came back. But I have as many good proofs as I want. I have, or rather I once had, a silver bullet, which was shot into a wolf by the Garde Champêtre of our district, and that silver bullet I extracted from the leg of my nephew. I saw his deeds. I heard of his dreams. I have seen, many people have seen, his footprints. I have heard his breath and his snort. There are stranger things. Shall I mention one? Of many. After he removes his clothes, when the change is about to overcome him, he finds it imperatively necessary to urinate. He has told me of that. Now I ask you, has my victim of lycanthropy read Petronius and other more obscure sources to know that this is a universal trait of werewolves before the metamorphosis, and why should he want to follow their hints as to the manner of the ceremony? Nonsense. I can't quite see the point you wish to make, monsieur. I do not deny that the symptoms of the delusion are alike in all its victims. On the contrary, the symptoms would be alike. And if urinating is one of them, why then of course it belongs there, like a fever and diphtheria. Moreover, the act of urinating can be explained more simply by the cold air striking the skin of the body. A lowering of temperature invariably brings on the desire to rid the body of the larger amount of moisture required in a warmer atmosphere. It is akin to a sudden condensation and precipitation. Why not to the sudden necessity of getting rid of an excess of moisture? Because a wolf naturally carries less? Good Lord, doctor, do you think I lived 20 years with this thing without debating with myself every single minute? 10 years would not suffice here to recapitulate the entire story of the origin and mystery of this creature. I was as unwilling as you to accept the facts. I am not by nature gullible. I take for granted your original incredulity. I ask myself only how you ever changed. How could you ever come to believe that he was metamorphosed into a wolf? That is per se preposterous. Certain things, many things, some small in themselves, but all of them together presenting an invincible argument, made me change my mind. His birth on Christmas Eve, for example. Statistics will show, I am sure, said Dumas eagerly, that thousands born on that day have had lives no different from the rest of us. Are you going to bring up astrology? Not at this moment, said Aymar, but science has still not explained many phenomena of human character and emotion. Would you set limits to science? Dumas raised his voice. Man is a compound of chemicals, and some day we shall write the chemical reaction of love. Tamirat, Galliez retorted. Man is a union of spirit and matter. In the instant between life and death, for example, what leaves the body? Chemical. No, but the chemical order or aggregation is altered there. Ha ha. So we do have a remarkable change of form here. What do you mean? Simply that the alteration from man to wolf is no greater than from life to death. Rhetoric, monsieur. That's no answer. Are you at loss for a scientific argument? But man, Dumas bellowed. Consider what you are saying, that a man can turn into a wolf. A wolf, remark you, that has no sweat glands, whose bones and teeth, hard bodies, mind you, are all differently shaped, whose every cell and every hair and nerve. And why not? Said Galliez, flourishing his wine glass. Do not such changes take place in nature? Have you never seen water change to ice? Oh come. Have you never seen two gases unite suddenly into a snowy powder? Yes, but. And a worm change into a showy butterfly? Yes, but in a whole month of time. What difference does time make? Is not time infinitely divisible? If a wheel can turn once a year, can it not also turn 1,000,000 times a second? The life of some animals is the twinkling of an eye, while of others it is a century. I concede you that, said Dumas slowly, but you have mentioned the butterfly. Have you ever seen it turn back into a worm? No, but if, as you said, life is a chemical reaction, is there any reason why it should not be reversible? No, the doctor said slowly, for he was beginning to recall his professional discretion. He'd better not argue himself out of a patient here. He swung slowly around until he was agreeing with Aymar. And those eyebrows that meet, Aymar pursued. Yes, I've noticed that, but I took that for a sign of hereditary syphilis. Not at all, said Aymar. And those nails? A common enough sign. Interlocking teeth set with little spaces between. Of course, there are wide variations in the dentition of man. And those hairy palms. Very strange that, isn't it? Not so much any one of these signs, but all together. It is as if the beast in him peeped forth here and there. And then, of course, his actions more than anything else. Said the doctor. You know, Aymar Galliez, that what you say there interests me immensely. It unfolds a remarkable new theory for all the inexplicable manifestations of morbid and abnormal psychology, the intrusion even in partial degrees of lower forms of life into the human form. Or, attractive though the idea is, I cannot accept your conclusions fully, but I intend to study the matter. From this point the discussion grew more and more one-sided and even more flattering to Aymar. When he arose to go, it was with renewed and increased faith that in Dr. Dumas' sanatorium, he had found the ideal spot for Bertrand. In fact, he felt a little concerned for the doctor. I hope you can do him some good, Dr. Dumas, but let me give you a little friendly warning. Be careful. He's a dangerous criminal. Watch out for him. And if you must approach him, remember to cross yourself. Thank you for your advice, the doctor replied. I shall avail myself of it. And may I communicate to you the results of my observations? He stood at the door, and as he watched Aymar go off with a more unsteady limp than usual, he snorted quietly. I may have 2 patients yet, out of that family. Bertrand, when not in a rage and not drugged, had now no pleasures in life but these 2, the singing of Sophie and the hope of revenge on Paul. As for communication with his uncle, that had best be given up, even as a dream, for it was plain that they would never let Aymar up here, and equally plain that they would never let him down unless he was drugged, if not by food then by an injection. And as for writing, there was no possibility of that. Not only was material lacking, but how to post a letter, even should one succeed in writing it? Often, when ruminating thus over his miserable fate, Bertrand was overcome with sadness. It might happen that the faint singing of Sophie would sound through the wall. The bitterness would vanish from his grief. Tears would come to his eyes. Sophie, he would say to himself, Sophie, and he would lie down on his mattress, which was on the floor and constituted his entire bed, in fact, his entire furniture, and imagine she was in his arms. Her black curls were in his face, her soft, moist lips against his, and her slender arms about his body. And the dream would last until the singing ceased. Then he would beg, sing again, Sophie, sing another song. And if, as sometimes happened, the flat, drawn-out notes rose again, then he was almost certain that she knew he was here in the room next door, and that she knew he wanted to hear her sing. After a while the singing alone was not enough. The mere dream of Sophie no longer held. He must get into the next room. But how? He formulated 100 bold plans and rejected all. He discovered, however, that he could manage to leap up to the oval window, catch on to the sill, and by digging his toes into the wall, almost hitch himself up to a seating position. If only his toes could secure a better hold on the wall. With his fingernails, with a splinter of bone, he remedied that. 2 little niches now served to give him a good purchase on the wall and actually to seat himself on the sill. Chance favored him there. The entire framework of the oval window, bars and all, was loose in its setting of stone. Evidently the workman who had made a permanent opening above the glass for ventilation had loosened the frame from the plaster and not bothered to repair his damage, or else time had shrunk the wood to its present size. In any case, one could take hold of the bars and pull out the whole window as if it were a stopper. Having made sure of this, Bertrand waited feverishly until late at night to explore further. Just outside the oval window to the right was a steep roof, and from this projected a dormer window that led evidently to Sophie's room. On the other side was a blank wall, so that escape on that side was impossible. But the dormer window might be reached. The steep roof was dangerous but accessible. Trembling with excitement, Bertrand made his preparations. He rolled up his mattress lengthwise into a cylinder and pushed it through the opening until it dropped to the ground below. We'll jump on that, he determined. We'll either hit it and run off together, or miss it and die together in suicide, as we so often planned. It happened on this night that Paul was in a mood to be with a woman, and this was unfortunate, for the patient who had been accustomed to receive him for several years now had just been removed by her relatives. The only other possibilities were 2 female patients who were, so to speak, the property of the other 2 orderlies. Paul debated whether to affront the jealousy and anger of one of his comrades or attempt to sneak out of the asylum and get to the village. Then the little mongoloid occurred to him. That'll be fun, he promised himself. He knew she was fond of candy, so he took some up with him, and expected no difficulty, nor did he encounter any. His pleasure, however, was short-lived. He heard a noise at the window, looked up, and had no time to escape a dark form that hurled itself at him. In a second the combat was over. The blood spurted from his torn artery in a high, wide arc and splashed onto the floor. The arc diminished, sank back to its origin, where now the blood only welled up in ever slower pulsations. Bertrand lay there in a kind of stupor, from a surfeit of ecstasy. At last he roused himself, struggled against the sluggishness of his mind, and looked about in the dark room. In this chamber, lit only by the moonlight from outside, he saw a strange dwarfish woman with a heavy brown face and stringy gray hair. She was seated on the bed, naked, and sucking at a stick of barley sugar, and because it was good, she began to coo to herself. His mind was incapable of accepting this. "Sophie," he said, bewildered. "What have they done to you?" There was a noise outside in the hall. Without puzzling out the matter, he picked her up and cried, "Come, Sophie, let us die together." And holding her clasped tightly in his arms, he stepped upon the sill and leaped for the mattress lying on the lawn below. "My most profitable patient, too," Dr. Dumas said, and sighed. Investigations being annoying things at best, the doctor suppressed the triple death as much as he could, filled out appropriate death certificates, dated them differently, and held the funerals at a week's interval. There were only 2 funerals. Dr. Dumas had long been anxious to dissect the mongoloid and wrote for permission to the Marquis, saying that he would pay the usual price. The old skinflint will be glad to earn a couple of francs. But the old skinflint was not. The remains of Madame la Marquise de la Roche-Ferrand must rest in the family vault, he declared proudly and sternly. And when one comes to think it over, why not? Alive and in the family castle, she might have been a source of annoyance. But whom could she disturb or embarrass? In the family tomb? Beryl de Montfort came just a week too late to the asylum in search of Bertrand. He had been delayed by trouble with his eye. When he heard that Bertrand had just died, he cursed his fate. He had promised himself so much from his revenge. "Death," he exclaimed bitterly, "robs me of both my love and my hate." He wanted to see the grave. For a tip, an orderly took him over to the cemetery and pointed out the mound. Beryl bent down over the fresh sod and, rendered furious by this climax of frustration, muttered viciously, "I'd like to dig you up, you dog, and spit in your face." This completes the elucidation of the Galliez script. Famous American spiritualist and physical medium, 1833 to 1886. He was examined by Lord Crookes, the celebrated physicist who was convinced of Holmes' power to levitate himself, etc. Appendix. About this period, that is to say, 1875 to 1880, the question of municipal hygiene was much to the fore. The great researches in microbiology, in the causes of disease, in sanitary engineering demanded that municipalities take an active hand in improving the hygienic conditions of populous centers. Among other matters, the disposal of the dead elicited much argument. The practice of burial was attacked as unhygienic, and proponents of cremation demanded state action, making incineration of corpses not merely lawful but required. The practice long followed, and still followed, of burying stillbirths and embryos in privies or otherwise privately disposing of them, was forbidden by law in numerous places. The history of municipal government shows that little attention was paid to such matters until the 19th century. Apparently one of the first attempts to show the insalubrity of intramuros burials in great cities was that of Duras Fernel and Hollier of Paris, who in 1554 expressed fears concerning the cemetery of the Innocents, a great charnel field which in 1186 had been allotted for the burial of the deceased of Paris. Here great pits were dug and the coffins placed solidly side by side and one upon the other, until some 2,000 were buried, or rather exposed, for only with the placing of the last coffin was the pit covered with soil. During its existence this cemetery, swollen by the addition of 2 million bodies, rose 10 feet above the level of the surrounding territory and at places overflowed the walls. Old pits were frequently opened and the bones thrown into great heaps. Subsequently, some of this vast mass of human relics was put in the Paris catacombs, which were really former quarries whence fine stone was extracted. To make matters worse, this great cemetery of the innocents was surrounded by a vast gutter into which the surrounding quarters of the city were accustomed to cast the ordure of the houses. In those days latrines were generally on the top floors only, and when these were cleaned the matter was thrown into the moat about the cemetery, from whence it was upon occasion removed. Such was the mephitic nature of the ground and air in this region that citizens complained they could not keep birds in cages, the poor beasts dying promptly within a week of being brought into the houses of the neighborhood. Moreover, it was impossible to go down into the cellars with a candle or lamp. Any flame was at once extinguished in this noxious underground breath. Barrel makers and other workers having to labor in cellars were frequently seized with such spells that they came near dying, and gradually these regions were abandoned, especially when it was found that the sweat of the walls was positively poisonous and would raise ill-smelling suppurating boils if it came into contact with the bare skin. Despite this, the city had become crowded with poor people who could find no other shelter than this horrible cemetery. Many dug themselves subsoil grottos in which they practically lived, with what effect on their general viability one may well imagine. Perhaps worse than this was the habit of burying people in churches. The limited space and the desire for financial gain among the clergy caused the bodies to be withdrawn as soon as possible, even before complete decomposition, and stored elsewhere in the church, in the garret, etc. In 1870, the work of de Freycinet on municipal sanitation, together with the necessity of providing for more cemetery space in Paris, caused considerable discussion on the matter of hygienic burial grounds. The recent Franco-Prussian War, too, had precipitated the question of the disposal of great numbers of dead in a sanitary fashion. Among others, M. Coupry Fils, an architect of Nantes, patented a hygienic cemetery construction, the Système Coupry, which he proposed to install in his Cimetière de l'Avenir. A test of Coupry's method was carried out in a portion of the Saint-Nazaire cemetery. Here a number of bodies were buried above the device which facilitated the circulation of air beneath the coffins and drained the soil of waters, and an equal number of corpses were buried as near to the test portion as possible and allowed to remain for varying years in the soil. In this system, the deleterious gases which collect in the underground pipes are brought to an oven and there burnt. For its best operation, the Coupry system demands burial in simple wooden coffins without the use of antiseptic substances, embalming, impregnated sawdust or charcoal, since the purpose of the system is the rapid disintegration of the body to a skeleton, with the complete disappearance of all the corruptible fleshy parts. It is, of course, well known that the French Revolution began the practice of forbidding church burial by state legislation of the 23rd of the month, prairial of the year 12, and limited the creation of new cemeteries to beyond the city walls. It forbade the burying of one coffin upon another and limited the burial to 5 years, except for those who wished to pay exorbitant sums for perpetual burial plots. Further, the depth of burial was stipulated so that noxious gases would not reach and contaminate the outside air. Since then, France, particularly the prefecture of the Seine, has interested itself constantly in the betterment of burial grounds, and it early appointed a commission to investigate the Coupry system. The report published by Dr. P. Brouardel and O. du Mesnil contains a complete study of this system. For the purpose of their report, the above-mentioned members of the committee, appointed by the prefecture of the Seine, Commission d'Assainissement Board of Health, exhumed 10 bodies, 5 Coupry, 5 plain, which they subjected to a complete examination. Thus, Sieur G. Baptiste, 53 years of age, died March 20, 1876. Buried March 21, 1876. Exhumed May 25, 1881. Again. Exhumed June 9, 1881. Length of inhumation 5 years. In untreated portion of the cemetery, this cadaver, see accompanying photograph, is absolutely intact. It has been transformed into corpse fat. Bad odor. Autopsy was performed by Professor Brouardel. All the viscera have grown thinner and are flattened out against the walls of the thorax and abdomen. Only the heart is still voluminous and perfectly recognizable. All process of decomposition seems to have been halted. Apparently the body will remain in this state indefinitely. A single insect of the Staphylinides family, a Philanthus abeninus, is found in the coffin. Contrast this with a body disinterred from a treated section, where it had remained but a year. Sir B, 66 years of age, see photograph. Died May 21, 1880. Interred May 22, 1880. Cerebral congestion, length of inhumation, 1 year and 18 days. Body was not shrouded. No odor spread by body. Skeleton is almost completely relieved of all soft parts. Head is separated from body. The destruction of the fleshy and soft parts is complete. Numerous insects are found in the coffin. Anthemicides, Ophrya cadaverina, and Lemistoma. One fly, quite alive, had just come forth from the numerous nymphaeas of the Ophia. However, the reader of this book can hardly be interested in the above details. The author's reason for introducing this report is to quote a small portion of it which seems to have some relation to our story. Among the bodies exhumed was one, Sieur C. Bertrand, cerebral hemorrhage, not illustrated. Died August 9, 1873. Buried August 10, 1873. Exhumed June 10, 1881. Length of inhumation, 8 years 2 months. The following case was reported to the conservator of the cemetery and by him forwarded to the Department of Criminal Justice. Evidently a case of grave robbery or a grim prank of the fossoyeurs, gravediggers. The body of Sieur C. was not found in the coffin, instead that of a dog, which despite 8 years in the ground was still incompletely destroyed. The fleshy parts and the furry hide are found mingled in a fatty mass of indistinguishable composition, adipocere. A nauseous odor spreads from the body. No insects. Cemetery of the Future. See copy in the 42nd Street Library, New York. Not reproduced here. The reader may consult the original. See preceding footnote. The economic motive here is not to be concealed, and intrudes upon the hygienic. If bodies will, by the système Couperin, form skeletons in 1 year, the 5-year burial period may be reduced to 1 year with a consequent greater turnover in the cemeteries and an increased income to the